Forget the lavish table you imagine when you think of a meal. In first-century Palestine, most families ate with their hands, sitting on a packed earth floor, sharing a single clay dish among 5, 6, sometimes 8 people. What was inside that dish was almost always the same thing, and it was brutally simple. The Galilee that Jesus walked through on foot during his 3 years of public ministry was not a land of abundance for those living in the lowest layers of society. It is estimated that between 80 and 90% of the population of first-century Palestine lived in what we would today classify as extreme poverty. They were peasants, artisanal fishermen, shepherds tending other people's flocks, day laborers who woke up not knowing if they would have work that day, and small craftsmen who traded the products of their own hands for handfuls of grain. The economy was overwhelmingly agrarian, and the gap between those who ate well and those who barely ate at all was an almost unbridgeable chasm. On one side, the priestly elite of Jerusalem, the tax collectors in the service of Rome, and the great landowners of the Jordan Valley. On the other, everyone else, and everyone else was a great many. The most fundamental food, the gravitational center of the entire diet of the poor, was bread. Not the soft, fluffy bread you know. First-century bread was a flat, dense, hard disk made from barley flour, not wheat. Wheat did exist, yes, but it was considered a superior grain, reserved for those who could afford to pay more. Barley cost about half the price of wheat in the markets of Judea, and for that reason it became the grain of the poor par excellence. The book of Judges, chapter 7, verse 13, records a dream in which a barley loaf rolls downhill and knocks over a tent, and commentators already noted that barley was a symbol of the common people, of Gideon's army made up of simple folk. When the Gospel of John, chapter 6, reports the multiplication of the loaves, the detail that many overlook is that the 5 loaves offered by the boy were made of barley. It was no coincidence. It was a social portrait. That boy was poor. The process of making bread began long before the oven. The women, because it was almost exclusively women's work, would wake before dawn to grind the grain. They used manual stone mills called domestic millstones, each piece weighing between 15 and 20 kilograms. The movement was repetitive, grueling, and lasted between 1 and 3 hours a day, depending on the size of the family. The sound of millstones being turned was so omnipresent in the villages that the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 25, verse 10, mentions it as a symbol of daily life. And when that sound stopped, it meant the village was dead or abandoned. After grinding, the grain became a coarse flour, mixed with water and a little salt, when salt was available. The leaven, when used, came from a piece of dough saved from the previous day, kept in a corner of the kitchen. Many times the bread was baked without any leaven at all, directly on stones heated in the fire or on the inner wall of a communal clay oven called a tabun. These ovens were shared among 3 to 5 families from the same village, and there were informal schedules and shifts for their use. Firewood was scarce in much of Galilee. So many families used dried animal dung as fuel, which altered the taste and smell of the bread in ways that the modern palate would probably reject at the first bite. An average family of 5 to 6 people consumed between 1.5 and 2 kilograms of bread per day. This meant that the woman of the house needed to grind at least that amount of grain every morning, every day, without exception. Archaeologists who analyzed female skeletons from first-century Galilean villages found bone deformities in the knees, wrists, and spine directly linked to the continuous use of manual millstones. The bread that fed the family was literally destroying the body of the woman who prepared it. After bread, the second pillar of the diet of the poor was olives and olive oil. The olive tree was called the tree of life in the ancient world, and with good reason. Its fruits served as direct food, consumed preserved in salt or simply dried in the sun, and were also the raw material for olive oil, which simultaneously functioned as cooking fat, fuel for oil lamps, medicine for wounds, moisturizer for the skin, and even a hygiene product. A single mature olive tree could produce between 30 and 50 kilograms of olives per harvest, yielding about 5 to 10 liters of oil. But note, an olive tree took 8 to 12 years to begin producing. This meant that whoever had olive trees had wealth, and whoever didn't had to buy oil or trade labor for it. For the poorest, olive oil was used with an economy that borders on the unimaginable. A domestic oil lamp consumed about half a liter of oil every 4 days. A family that wanted to have light at night and fat for cooking needed at least 2 liters of oil per week. When the oil ran out, food was prepared without any fat. Grains cooked in plain water, and the house was plunged into total darkness after the sun went down. The parable of the 10 virgins in Matthew 25 takes on a completely different dimension when you understand that running out of oil was not just running out of light. It was running out of food, medicine, and protection against the cold of the night. The third constant element on the table of the poor was legumes. Lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans constituted the main source of protein for those without regular access to meat. The episode of Esau selling his birthright for a plate of lentils, narrated in Genesis 25, is often read as a sign of weakness of character. But the reading changes when you understand the dietary context. Esau came back from the field exhausted, truly famished, and the lentil stew that Jacob prepared was probably the most substantial meal available at that moment. Lentils cooked with garlic, onion, and a drizzle of olive oil were the most complete meal a poor person of the ancient world could aspire to without spending a single coin on meat. A serving of lentils provided protein, iron, and carbohydrates sufficient to sustain hours of manual labor. It was not a contemptible dish. It was the fuel of survival. Chickpeas were equally important. Cooked and mashed with a little olive oil and sesame, they formed a paste that the peoples of the Levant still consume today, the direct ancestor of what the modern world knows as hummus. Excavations in Jericho and in villages near the Sea of Galilee have found carbonized remains of chickpeas in domestic vessels dated to the 1st century, confirming that consumption was daily and massive. Fava beans, in turn, were more common in Egypt and Judea than in Galilee, but still appeared as part of the diet of rural workers. Where did animal protein come from when legumes were not enough? The answer depended on the region. In the villages near the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum, Bethsaida, Magdala, fish was the most accessible source. The lake that the Bible calls the Sea of Galilee is about 21 kilometers long by 13 wide, and in the 1st century it harbored abundant populations of tilapia and sardines. The Galilean tilapia, now commercially called St. Peter's fish, could reach up to 40 centimeters and was caught with nets cast from the shore or from small wooden boats. The lake sardine was smaller, between 10 and 15 centimeters, and was preserved in salt to last weeks or months. Magdala, the city of Mary Magdalene, was known precisely for the salted fish trade. Its name in Greek, Tarichei, literally means place of salted fish. The salt needed for preservation came from the Dead Sea, transported in caravans that traveled up the Jordan Valley, and was expensive enough that the expression worth its weight in salt was taken almost literally. For those who lived far from the lake, fresh fish was inaccessible. Meat, in turn, was an almost absolute luxury. A lamb or young goat was slaughtered only on special occasions, weddings, religious festivals like Passover, or when the animal was too old to produce milk or wool. Killing a young, productive animal for food was a waste that no poor family could afford. Animal fat, called tallow, was used down to the last drop. Bones were boiled and reboiled to extract any trace of nutrient. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was discarded. Beef was practically non-existent in the diet of the poor. Oxen were working animals, used to plow the land and haul loads. Slaughtering an ox for food would be the equivalent of destroying your tractor and your truck at the same time. Only the very wealthy sacrificed oxen at banquets, and even then, the act was so exceptional that the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15 marks the son's return with the slaughter of a fattened calf, precisely because this was the ultimate sign of celebration. And milk. Milk existed, but not in the way you imagine. Without refrigeration, raw milk would sour within a few hours under the heat of the eastern Mediterranean, where temperatures exceeded 40 degrees Celsius in summer. What the poor consumed was already fermented milk, transformed into curds or a primitive yogurt that could last a bit longer. Cheese was another important derivative, simple, salty, pressed in wicker baskets that gave the product its characteristic shape. The Hebrew word for cheese, Jevinah, appears in Job chapter 10, verse 10, in a metaphor that compares the formation of the human body to the process of curdling milk. It was an image that any first-century listener understood immediately because everyone knew the process up close. Fruits complemented the diet on a seasonal basis. Figs, dates, and pomegranates were the most common and the most important. The fig was so central to the diet that the Bible mentions it more than 50 times. The fig tree that Jesus cursed in Mark 11 was not just any tree, it was a symbol of sustenance. Fresh figs were available between June and September, but their true importance lay in their dried form. Dried figs could be stored for months, compacted into blocks that functioned as the energy bars of the ancient world. Soldiers, travelers, and rural workers carried blocks of dried figs as marching provisions. The first book of Samuel, chapter 25, reports that Abigail brought 200 fig cakes to David. It was campaign food, fuel for men on the move. Dates offered one of the few sweet flavors available to the poor. Date honey, a thick syrup produced by the prolonged boiling of the fruit, was in fact what many scholars believe to be the honey mentioned in the expression, "a land flowing with milk and honey" in Exodus 3. Bee honey existed, but it was rare, expensive, and risky to harvest. Date honey, on the other hand, could be produced in any home that had a date palm and a little patience. Grapes, in turn, were consumed both fresh and dried in the form of raisins. But their primary destination was wine, and wine was not a luxury, it was a necessity. In a context where the available water was frequently contaminated by parasites and bacteria, wine diluted in water served as a natural purifier. Alcoholic fermentation eliminated a good portion of the dangerous microorganisms, making the drink safer than plain water. Paul recommends to Timothy in 1 Timothy 5, verse 23, to drink a little wine because of his frequent stomach problems, advice that probably reflected common practical knowledge of the time. The wine of the poor was acidic, thick, diluted in 2 or 3 parts water, and very far from the sophistication of the wines that the Roman elite imported from Italy and Greece. But it served its purpose. It hydrated, nourished with its calories, and reduced the risk of intestinal diseases that killed thousands every year. Now put the seasoning into perspective. Salt, cumin, dill, mint, mustard, coriander, and hyssop were the most common spices in first-century Palestine, but not all of them were within reach of the poor. Salt was the most essential and the most contested. It came from the Dead Sea or from salt mines in regions such as present-day Jordan, and its price varied according to the distance from the point of extraction. In Jerusalem, salt was relatively affordable. In the remote villages of Upper Galilee, it was treated as a precious commodity. Jesus' famous phrase in Matthew 5, "You are the salt of the earth," resonated with particular force among listeners who knew exactly what it meant to run out of salt. Cumin and dill were grown in small domestic gardens and used both for seasoning and for medicinal purposes. Hyssop, mentioned in Psalm 51 as an instrument of purification, grew wild on the rocky hillsides and was used to sprinkle blood in rituals and to add flavor to soups and stews. A typical meal of a poor Galilean family in the 1st century followed an almost invariable pattern. In the morning, barley bread with olives or a handful of dried figs, accompanied by water or curdled milk. At midday, when there was anything at all, it was a piece of bread with chickpea paste or a handful of roasted grains that workers carried in their pockets. The main meal took place at dusk, when the entire family gathered on the floor of the house. Usually a single room measuring 4 by 5 meters that served as living room, kitchen, and bedroom. The central dish was a stew of lentils or chickpeas with onion and garlic, seasoned with cumin and served in the same vessel in which it was cooked. Everyone ate from the same container, using pieces of bread as spoons. There were no utensils. There were no individual plates. There was no table. This absence of a table is more significant than it seems. When the Gospels describe the Last Supper, the original Greek text indicates that Jesus and the disciples were reclining, a position typical of the Greco-Roman banquets of the upper class, where guests would lie on couches around a low table. This detail suggests that the Passover meal was a ritualistic exception, a moment when even the poor imitated the customs of the rich as a way of celebrating the freedom of the Exodus. In everyday life, however, no one reclined. They sat on the ground, cross-legged, around a straw mat. Egg consumption was irregular and depended on availability. Domestic chickens already existed in 1st century Palestine. Archaeological evidence confirms the presence of chicken bones at sites such as Jerusalem and Sepphoris. But egg production was unpredictable and generally low. An ancient hen produced between 50 and 100 eggs per year, far fewer than the 300 to 350 that a modern hen produces through selective breeding. Eggs were consumed boiled or mixed into dough and were frequently sold at the market rather than eaten because they earned coins that could buy enough grain to feed more mouths. Vegetables were simple and limited. Onion, garlic, leek, cucumber, and wild lettuce were the most common. The Book of Numbers, chapter 11, verse 5, records the Israelites' complaint in the desert, remembering with longing the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic they used to eat in Egypt. A passage that reveals both the value of these foods and the monotony of the diet in the wilderness. In the 1st century, these same vegetables continued to be the basis of the plant-based diet of the poor. They were consumed raw, in salads seasoned with salt and vinegar, or cooked in soups that made use of whatever leftovers were available. And what did the poor drink besides wine and water? Barley beer existed in regions with Egyptian influence, but it was not common in Jewish Palestine. Vinegar diluted in water, called posca by the Romans, was the official drink of Roman soldiers and manual laborers. It was cheap, lasted weeks without spoiling, and quenched thirst effectively. When the Gospels record that vinegar was offered to Jesus on the cross, it was not necessarily an additional act of cruelty. It was what was available. It was the drink of the poor and the soldiers. Food preservation was a constant battle against heat and insects. Without refrigeration, without airtight packaging, without any technology beyond salt, sun, and air, each food had a short and unforgiving shelf life. Dry grains lasted months if stored in ceramic jars well sealed with beeswax. Olives in brine could last the entire year. Dried figs and dates held up for weeks. But any cooked dish had to be consumed the same day. Leftovers left for the following day attracted flies, larvae, and bacteria that caused devastating intestinal diseases. Dysentery was one of the leading causes of death among children and the elderly in the ancient world, and a large portion of cases was directly linked to contaminated food. Life expectancy in 1st century Palestine hovered around 35 to 40 years, and poor nutrition was a determining factor in that brutal number. Jewish dietary laws, the precepts of kashrut, added an extra layer of complexity to the diet of the poor. Pork was forbidden, seafood without scales and without fins, such as shrimp, squid and crab, was unclean. Blood could not be consumed under any circumstances. Milk and meat could not be prepared together. For families that could barely put food on the table, these restrictions were not just religious. They were real limits that further reduced the already scarce options available. But obedience to the dietary laws was non-negotiable. Eating impure food was not just a sin, it was social exclusion. It meant being cast out of the community, out of the synagogue, out of the collective protection that kept the poor alive. How much did it cost to eat? An ordinary laborer, according to the parable of the workers in the vineyard, narrated in Matthew 20, received 1 denarius for a day's work. 1 denarius could buy about 6 to 8 kilograms of barley or 3 to 4 kilograms of wheat. It seems sufficient until you calculate that a family of 6 needed at least 2 kilograms of grain per day, plus oil, plus salt, plus legumes, plus fuel for the fire. In practice, the daily denarius barely covered basic nutrition, leaving almost nothing for clothing, taxes and emergencies. And that was when there was work. Day laborers faced entire days without being hired, which meant entire days without food. The parable that Jesus tells is not just about divine generosity. It is about real desperation. Those men who stood all day in the square waiting for work were not resting. They were hungry. Taxes worsened the situation to an almost unbearable degree. The Jews of the first century paid taxes to Rome, a tribute on land, a tax on agricultural products, tolls on roads and bridges, and also paid tithes to the temple in Jerusalem. Historians estimate that the total tax burden could consume between 35% and 45% of a peasant family's production. This meant that nearly half of everything a poor person planted, harvested and produced went into the hands of Rome or the priests of Jerusalem. What was left was a margin for survival, not for living. In this scenario, it makes perfect sense that Jesus chose food as the central metaphor of his teaching. Bread, wine, fish, salt, leaven, seeds, harvest. The vocabulary of food permeates the Gospels from beginning to end, not as a literary device, but as a language that his audience understood with their stomachs. When Jesus says, "I am the bread of life," in John 6, every Galilean listener knew the exact weight of that word. Bread was the line between living and dying. When he multiplies fish and loaves for 5,000 people, he is not merely performing a miracle. He is responding to the most basic and most urgent need of a crowd that had probably not eaten anything all day. When he breaks the bread at the Last Supper and says, "This is my body," he is taking the most common and most sacred element of the lives of those people and transforming its meaning forever. It is in this context that the Lord's Prayer gains its rawest dimension. Give us this day our daily bread. It was not a metaphor. It was not spiritualization. It was the most urgent request a poor person of the first century could make. Today, not tomorrow, not next week. Today, because tomorrow was too uncertain to plan for. Today, in a world where tons of food are discarded every day, where restaurants throw away in a single night what would feed an entire Galilean village for a week. The table of the first century poor serves as an uncomfortable mirror. Those families did not have the luxury of waste. Every crumb had a purpose. Every leftover had a function. Every meal was treated as what it truly was, an event of survival. The numbers are brutal when compared. An average family in first century Palestine survived on a fraction of what any person below the poverty line consumes today in industrialized countries. And yet, those tables on packed earth floors, lit by cheap olive oil lamps, gathered entire families around a ritual that modernity has nearly destroyed. The act of eating together, slowly, sharing the little that exists. The food of the poor in Jesus' time was not merely sustenance. It was a silent declaration that it is possible to live with dignity even when the entire world conspires to take even the bread from your hand.